A lonely veteran with one leg notices an old cat looking at him. When he realizes where he's seen it before, he can't believe it. The rhythm of Walter Schmidt's life was marked by the quiet click and faint hydraulic sigh of his prosthetic leg. It was the first sound he was truly conscious of each morning as he swung his residual limb over the side of the bed and reached for the prosthesis standing sentinel beside it, and often the last as he unstrapped it at night. 30-odd years had passed since the searing heat and chaos of a Desert Storm roadside bomb had irrevocably altered his body and his path, but the leg remained a constant, tangible reminder. Now, in his early 60s, Walter lived with it not in bitterness, but with a kind of weary resignation, an accepted fact like the Ohio weather or the slow passage of time. He resided alone in the small house on Maple Street where he'd grown up, on the quiet edge of Harmony Creek, a town that felt suspended somewhere between modest progress and perpetual nostalgia. His parents were long gone, and his younger sister lived out west, their contact reduced to occasional phone calls and Christmas cards. Walter had never married. There had been attempts, relationships started in the difficult years after his return from the Gulf, but they'd faltered, foundering against the rocks of his changed perspective, his withdrawn nature, and the phantom pains that sometimes radiated from a limb no longer there. Eventually, he'd stopped trying, retreating into the predictable solitude of his small world. His days were ordered, methodical. He rose early, went through the careful process of fitting the prosthesis, made coffee, read the local paper. He kept the house and small yard meticulously neat, a counterpoint perhaps to the disorder he'd witnessed and carried within him. He supplemented his modest disability pension by doing small engine repairs in his garage. Lawnmowers, tillers, the occasional outboard motor, work that required patience and precision, qualities he possessed in abundance. Customers respected his skill and his quiet demeanor, dropping off machines, exchanging brief, necessary words, and leaving him mostly to his work and his silence. The emptiness of the house was a constant low hum beneath the surface of his routines. It wasn't just the absence of other people. It was the absence of expectation, the lack of shared moments, large or small. He ate his meals alone at the small kitchen table, watched the evening news alone in the living room armchair, the silence broken only by the tick of the mantel clock or the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. It wasn't an unhappy existence precisely. Walter wasn't given to self-pity, but it was profoundly solitary, a life lived in the long, quiet echo of past traumas and relinquished possibilities. His walks were essential, not just for physical health, managing the fit and function of his prosthesis, but for his mental equilibrium. He'd walk the familiar streets of Harmony Creek, nodding politely to acquaintances, observing the changing seasons, the small dramas of small-town life from a detached distance. He moved with a steady, slightly uneven gait, his prosthetic limb surprisingly quiet on the pavement, a testament to years of practice and adaptation. People in town were accustomed to seeing him, the quiet veteran with the artificial leg, a familiar landmark like the town square gazebo or the steeple of the Lutheran church. They offered him the respect due a former soldier, tempered perhaps by a slight unvoiced pity for his solitary state, though none would have dared express it to his face. He rarely varied his route, finding comfort in the predictability. down Maple Street, across Elm, past the library, looping around the town square and back home. It was a way to mark the day, to feel the air on his face, to participate in the life of the town without needing to fully engage. He often carried memories with him on these walks, ghosts from a different life. The oppressive heat of the desert, the camaraderie, the sudden violence, the bewildering aftermath in field hospitals and rehab centers. He didn't dwell on the worst of it. Years of practice had taught him to compartmentalize, but the echoes remained, surfacing sometimes in unexpected moments, triggered by a sound, a smell, a certain slant of light. They were part of him, like the prosthetic leg, integrated into the quiet landscape of his present. He sought no company beyond these fleeting memories and the surface-level interactions of his errands. Animals had never been part of his adult life. The responsibility, the potential for further loss, felt like burdens he couldn't bear. He observed the neighborhood cats, sleek, pampered pets, wary strays, with the same detachment he observed everything else. They belonged to a world of connection and care from which he felt quietly excluded by circumstance and by choice. His world was contained, predictable, solitary, and until the arrival of the persistent orange shadow, he had believed quite firmly that was how it would remain. It started subtly, a flash of color glimpsed at the edge of his vision as he worked in the garage, a flicker of movement near the lilac bushes bordering his backyard. Walter didn't pay it much mind at first. Stray cats were not uncommon in Harmony Creek, especially near the wooded edge where his property lay. They usually kept their distance, wary of humans, sticking to the shadows. But this one was different. It was an orange tabby, visibly old. Its coat was somewhat dull and ragged, not from neglect necessarily, but from the accumulated wear and tear of years spent largely outdoors. It wasn't skeletal, but it was lean, moving with the slight stiffness of age, particularly in its hindquarters. And it was persistent. Instead of vanishing when Walter emerged from the house or garage, the cat would simply stop, watch him with surprisingly steady, intelligent green eyes, then perhaps melt slowly back into the shrubbery or retreat to a cautious distance under the porch steps. It never approached closely, never made a sound, just observed. Walter initially found its presence mildly irritating. He wasn't hostile towards animals, but he didn't encourage them either. He kept his garbage can secure, left no food scraps out. There was nothing, logically, to attract the cat to his particular yard. He tried shooing it away once or twice, a gruff, "Go on, get!" But the cat merely retreated a few yards, waited patiently, and eventually reappeared. Then came the gifts. One morning, Walter opened his back door to find a single, perfectly formed dried oak leaf placed neatly on the top step. He frowned, assuming the wind had blown it there, and swept it off. The next day, a small, smooth gray stone appeared in the same spot. The day after, a crumpled blue bottle cap. He stood looking at the bottle cap, a flicker of something other than annoyance stirring within him. This wasn't the wind, it was the cat. Why? He'd heard of cats bringing prey to their owners, but leaves, stones, bottle caps? It made no sense, unless the cat wasn't bringing prey, but simply things. Things it found interesting, perhaps, placed deliberately on his doorstep. He started watching the cat more closely, intrigued despite himself. It would appear in the mornings, sit patiently near the back steps for a while, then disappear, sometimes leaving one of its small, insignificant offerings behind, sometimes not. It never tried to get inside, never rubbed against his legs if he was out in the yard. It just appeared, watched, sometimes left a token, and vanished again. Its persistence was puzzling. Walter found himself looking for it, noticing its absence on the rare days it didn't show up. The cat's quiet, unobtrusive presence became a new element in his predictable routine, an orange question mark hovering at the periphery of his solitary existence. One afternoon, Walter was sitting on his back steps, enjoying a rare spell of warm autumn sunshine, cleaning parts from a carburetor on an old newspaper spread beside him. The orange cat emerged from under the porch lattice, moving slowly, blinking in the bright light. It stopped about 10 feet away, sat down facing him, and began meticulously washing its face, pausing occasionally to glance at Walter with those steady green eyes. Walter continued his work, pretending to ignore the cat, yet acutely aware of its presence. There was something about the way it watched him, a calm, unwavering regard that felt familiar somehow. He tried to dismiss the feeling. It was just an old stray cat, likely hoping for a handout despite Walter's lack of encouragement. The cat finished grooming, stood up, stretched its stiff, elderly limbs, and then did something unexpected. It walked slowly towards the steps, not directly at Walter, but towards the edge of the newspaper where the carburetor parts lay gleaming with solvent. It sniffed delicately at a small brass jet, then looked up at Walter, holding his gaze for a long moment. It let out a soft, barely audible sound, a questioning little trill, before turning and slowly walking back towards the porch, disappearing under the lattice once more. Walter sat frozen, the carburetor part forgotten in his hand. That look, that soft, questioning sound. It struck a chord deep within him, resonating with something faint, elusive, buried under decades of carefully constructed defenses. A memory, hazy and distant, flickered at the edge of his consciousness like a half-forgotten dream. He shook his head, trying to clear it. It was just an old cat, nothing more. But the orange shadow, persistent and watchful, had somehow inexplicably begun to penetrate the quiet fortress of his solitude. The brief encounter on the back steps lingered with Walter. The old orange cat's direct gaze, the soft, questioning sound it had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He found himself scrutinizing the cat more closely during its now daily appearances. He noted the faint, darker, tabby stripes on its forehead, the way one ear had a small, ancient tear at the tip, the slight thickening around its joints that spoke of advanced age. He was still wary of forming any attachment, yet he couldn't deny a growing curiosity, a pull towards this persistent, silent visitor. The cat continued its routine, appearing near the back door, watching, occasionally leaving its odd little offerings. A bird feather, drably gray, not from any bright species. A shard of sun-purpled glass smoothed by time, once even a small muddy work glove likely dropped by a passing utility worker. Walter collected these items absently, dropping them into an old coffee can he kept in the garage, unsure why he didn't just throw them away. Then came a cold, rainy evening in late autumn. Walter was in his kitchen, preparing a simple supper, the rhythmic chop of vegetables, a familiar sound against the drumming of rain on the roof. He glanced out the window above the sink and saw the orange cat huddled miserably under the meager shelter of the porch roof overhang, trying to curl into itself against the damp chill, looking utterly dejected. Something twisted inside Walter. He remembered nights like this in basic training, soaked to the skin, bone-chillingly cold, yearning for warmth and dryness. He remembered the vulnerability, the sheer misery of being exposed to the elements. And this cat was old, arthritic perhaps. Enduring this couldn't be easy. He hesitated. Feeding a stray was asking for trouble. Everyone knew that. It encouraged dependence, made them hang around. He'd resisted for weeks, but seeing the cat hunched there, looking so frail and uncomfortable in the cold rain, before he could overthink it, he opened a can of tuna, meant for his own sandwich tomorrow, drained it, and scraped half of it onto a small saucer. He opened the back door just wide enough to slide the saucer out onto the top step, near where the cat was sheltering, but not so close as to force an interaction. The cat startled, flattening itself against the damp wood, watching him with wide, alarmed eyes. Walter retreated quickly, closing the door, feeling strangely self-conscious. He watched through the window. After a long moment, the cat crept forward cautiously, sniffed at the tuna, looked back towards the closed door, and then began to eat, quickly and hungrily, as if it hadn't had a decent meal in days. Watching the old cat devour the tuna, Walter felt a pang, sharp and unexpected. And then, the memory, the one that had flickered at the edges of his mind before, returned with sudden, startling clarity. He's barely 20, lean and nervous in his newly issued fatigues, just days away from shipping out to the Middle East for Desert Shield, the prelude to the storm. He's sitting behind his parents' house, the one on Maple Street, trying to process the enormity of what's coming, the fear churning in his gut. A movement near the woodpile catches his eye, a tiny orange kitten, impossibly small and thin, ribs starkly visible, shivering despite the late summer heat. It looks utterly lost, abandoned. On impulse, driven by a surge of pity and perhaps a projection of his own vulnerability, he opens the packed lunch his mother had made him, breaks off a piece of his sandwich, roast beef, and holds it out. The kitten, terrified but starving, creeps forward and snatches the offering, gobbling it down before darting back to perceived safety. He leaves out more, shares a little of the water from his canteen. He does this for 3 days, finding the kitten waiting each afternoon, a tiny bright spark of life in the shadow of his impending departure. Then he leaves. He ships out. He goes to war. He comes back broken, and he never thinks of the kitten again. Until now. Walter stared out the window at the old orange cat finishing the last scraps of tuna on the saucer, the rain still drumming down. Could it be? 30 years? More? Could this possibly be the same cat? It seemed impossible. Cats didn't live that long, did they? Especially not strays. And yet, the color was right. The persistence, that steady gaze that seemed both wary and knowing, the way it had appeared here at his childhood home, where he now lived again in his later years. The logical part of his brain insisted it was coincidence, a different orange cat, drawn by chance or scent. But the feeling, the resonance of the memory, was powerful, undeniable. He remembered the kitten's desperate hunger, its fragile hold on life. He remembered the small connection he'd felt, offering comfort to another vulnerable being just before facing his own mortality. Had that small act of kindness somehow anchored the creature, created a thread that stretched across decades of war, injury, and solitary survival for both of them. It was a fanciful notion, perhaps born of loneliness, of a longing for connection he rarely admitted even to himself. But as he watched the old cat meticulously lick the saucer clean before retreating back under the overhang to groom itself, Walter felt a profound shift within him. Whether it was truly the same cat almost didn't matter. The memory had forged a link. This persistent orange shadow was no longer just a stray. It was an echo from his past, a tangible reminder of a moment of shared vulnerability before his life irrevocably changed. He couldn't turn his back on it now. The door, both literally and figuratively, had been opened. The act of putting out the tuna felt like crossing a line, an unspoken commitment Walter hadn't intended, but now felt bound to honor. The memory of the kitten, sharp and poignant, overlaid itself onto the image of the old orange cat huddled on his porch. He couldn't unknow it, couldn't unfeel the connection, however improbable or illogical it seemed. He started leaving food out regularly, dry kibble bought discreetly at the grocery store along with his own supplies, placed in a heavy ceramic bowl near the back steps where it was sheltered from the worst of the weather. He put out fresh water daily, too. He didn't make a fuss about it, just quietly added it to his morning routine before retreating inside. The cat, whom Walter now privately thought of as Rusty, the name felt right for his color and his age, simple and unadorned like Walter himself, quickly learned the new routine. He would be waiting patiently near the steps each morning, though still keeping a cautious distance while Walter put the food down. He ate with the focused intensity of an animal for whom regular meals had likely been a long-forgotten luxury. Walter watched him from the kitchen window, noting the gradual changes. Over the weeks, Rusty's coat began to look slightly less ragged, perhaps a touch thicker as the weather grew colder. He still moved stiffly, but seemed to carry himself with a little more confidence, less of the perpetual hunched caution of a stray constantly anticipating threats. The gifts continued to appear occasionally, though less frequently now that food was provided. A crumpled piece of tin foil, a milkweed pod, a child's small plastic dinosaur missing a leg. Walter found himself almost looking forward to these small, inexplicable offerings, dropping them into the coffee can in the garage with a quiet shake of his head. He started talking to the cat, too. Not conversations exactly, but low murmurs as he put the food down. "Morning, Rusty. Cold one today." Or, "Looks like more snow coming. Better eat up." He felt foolish at first, talking to a cat, something he hadn't done since childhood. But the silence of the house seemed to press less heavily when punctuated by these one-sided exchanges. Rusty would sometimes pause in his eating and look up at Walter, blinking slowly before returning to his meal, offering no judgment, only quiet presence. As winter tightened its grip, with bitter winds and deeper snows, Walter began to worry about Rusty sleeping outside, even under the porch. The cat was old. Could he survive the truly frigid nights? The thought nagged at him. He found an old insulated cooler in the garage, lined it with straw and some old towels, and placed it in the most sheltered corner of the back porch, hoping Rusty might use it. He never saw the cat go inside it, but sometimes, on the coldest mornings, the straw looked slightly disturbed, suggesting it might have offered some refuge. Still, Walter worried. The memory of finding that other cat the abused one, frozen in the snowdrift years ago. News of Samuel Bellwether's rescue had quietly made the rounds back then, surfaced unbidden. He didn't want Rusty to suffer a similar fate. One particularly frigid evening, with temperatures plummeting well below zero and the wind howling around the eaves, Walter found himself standing at the back door, looking out at the empty porch. He hadn't seen Rusty seek shelter in the cooler. Where was he? Probably hunkered down under the porch itself, but still exposed. Walter opened the back door a crack. "Rusty," he called softly into the wind. A moment later, a familiar orange shape emerged hesitantly from the darkness beneath the porch steps, shivering, flecked with driven snow. Rusty looked up at him, meowing softly, a plaintive sound almost lost in the wind. Walter didn't think, he just acted. He opened the door wider. "Come on then," he said gruffly. "Get in here out of the cold, just for tonight." Rusty hesitated on the top step, looking from Walter to the warm, lit kitchen, then back out at the swirling snow. He took a tentative step across the threshold, then another, finally padding silently into the warmth of the house, shaking snow from his coat. He stopped just inside, looking around uncertainly, clearly overwhelmed. Walter closed the door quickly against the biting wind, shutting out the storm. The silence inside felt different now, charged with the presence of this wild yet strangely familiar creature. Rusty stood frozen on the worn linoleum, unsure of this new territory. "All right," Walter said softly. "Just stay there for a bit. Get warm." He went about his evening routine, making his supper, washing the dishes, pointedly ignoring the cat while remaining aware of its every flicker of movement. He didn't want to spook him back out into the cold. After about half an hour, Rusty seemed to relax fractionally. He took a few cautious steps, sniffing the leg of the kitchen table, the edge of the rug. He found the heat vent near the baseboard and settled down beside it, tucking his paws beneath him, soaking up the warmth. He closed his eyes, and soon a low, rumbling purr filled the quiet kitchen, a sound of profound, bone-deep contentment. Walter watched him from his armchair in the adjoining living room, a complex mix of emotions swirling within him. Irritation at his own lapse in resolve, concern for the implications of letting a stray inside, but overriding it all was a simple, undeniable gladness that the old cat was safe, warm, and purring in his kitchen. The door had been opened, letting the storm outside, and perhaps something essential inside. Rusty never really left after that first frigid night. He seemed to understand, with the uncanny wisdom of old animals, that sanctuary had been offered and accepted. He spent the rest of that winter mostly indoors, finding preferred spots. The warm patch by the heat vent, a threadbare patch on the living room rug that caught the afternoon sun. Eventually, even the faded cushion of the armchair opposite Walter's. Walter, for his part, adapted with surprising ease. He bought a proper litter box, placing it discreetly in the back mudroom. He bought better quality cat food, graduating from the basic kibble to formulas designed for senior cats. He even found himself picking up a small, soft mouse toy at the checkout counter one day, though Rusty mostly ignored it in favor of batting at stray dust bunnies. The transition wasn't entirely smooth. Rusty, having lived outdoors for potentially 2 decades, was set in his ways. He had no interest in being confined entirely, pacing restlessly by the back door some mornings until Walter relented and let him out for brief supervised patrols of the yard, always keeping a close eye on him. He remained wary of sudden movements and loud noises, a legacy of his long years fending for himself. He was not, by nature, a cuddly cat. He didn't seek laps, and tolerated petting only briefly and on his own terms. But the bond between them deepened into a quiet, unwavering companionship. Rusty became Walter's shadow, following him silently from room to room as he went about his day. If Walter worked in the garage, Rusty would find a spot on an old workbench to supervise. If Walter read in the living room, Rusty would occupy the other chair. If Walter sat on the porch steps, Rusty would soon appear, settling nearby. Their communication was largely nonverbal. A slow blink exchanged across the room, a soft chirp from Rusty when his food bowl was empty, a low rumble of a purr when Walter spoke to him in his quiet, gruff tones. Walter found himself talking to Rusty constantly now, narrating his actions, sharing observations, voicing thoughts he hadn't realized he'd been keeping bottled up for years. The cat was a perfect confidant, listening intently, or seeming to, offering no judgment, only quiet, steady presence. The crushing weight of loneliness that had defined Walter's existence for so long began to lift, almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft padding of paws on the floorboards, the occasional contented sigh from a napping cat, the rhythmic sound of purring. Having another living being to care for, one whose needs were simple and whose presence was undemanding, gave Walter a renewed sense of purpose. Rusty depended on him, and that dependence felt less like a burden and more like an anchor. People in Harmony Creek noticed the change, too. Walter still kept mostly to himself, but the constant presence of the old orange cat trotting patiently beside him on his walks around the yard, or waiting for him on the porch, or sometimes glimpsed sleeping in the window, softened his image. The mail carrier commented on it. "Never see you without your orange friend these days, Walter." The clerk at the grocery store asked how the old fella was doing when Walter bought cat food. He even struck up a cautious occasional conversation with Mrs. Gable from 2 streets over, an elderly widow who also had an ancient cat. They'd sometimes meet on their respective slow walks, Walter with his careful gait, Mrs. Gable leaning on her cane. They'd exchange pleasantries, compare notes on senior cat diets, or the best remedies for feline arthritis. These brief interactions, facilitated by their shared status as caretakers of aging animals, were small cracks of light in Walter's long-established reserve. He often thought about the memory, the kitten he'd fed before the war. Was Rusty truly the same cat? He'd likely never know for sure. The odds were astronomically against it. But in his heart, the connection felt real. He liked to think that small act of kindness decades ago had somehow reverberated, returning to him now in his own time of need, a frayed thread of connection miraculously unbroken across the years. Whether truth or comforting fiction, it gave shape and meaning to the quiet devotion of the old orange cat who now shared his life. They were an unlikely pair, the solitary veteran with his prosthetic leg and the ancient, resilient stray cat. Each bore the marks of a hard life. Each had navigated years of solitude. Now, in the twilight of their respective lives, they had found each other, becoming constants in a world that often felt transient and uncertain. They were, in their own quiet way, each other's last family member, bound by a shared history, remembered or imagined, and the simple, profound comfort of unwavering companionship. The years continued their steady, quiet march in Harmony Creek. Walter Schmidt turned 65, then 66, the silver at his temples now dominant. His prosthetic leg sometimes gave him more trouble, aching with the damp weather or after a bit too much exertion in the workshop, but his routine remained largely unchanged, anchored now by the unwavering presence beside him. Rusty, the orange cat, whose true age remained a mystery but was certainly venerable, perhaps 21, 22, or even older, showed the inevitable signs of his great seniority. He slept more profoundly, often curled tightly in his favorite armchair or stretched out in a sliver of sunlight, unmoving for hours. His movements were slower, stiffer, especially on cold mornings. Walter had elevated his food and water bowl slightly, making it easier for the old cat to eat and drink without bending so far. His hearing wasn't as sharp, and his eyesight seemed dimmer, but his purr, when coaxed forth, was still a surprisingly robust rumble. Their companionship had settled into a deep, comfortable groove, a testament to mutual reliance and unspoken understanding. They were rarely separated. When Walter worked in the garage, Rusty would nap on a designated old cushion nearby. When Walter read in the evenings, Rusty occupied the adjacent chair, or sometimes, with great effort, hauled his old bones onto the ottoman near Walter's feet. On milder days, their slow procession around the yard was a familiar sight. Walter, with his careful, rhythmic gait, Rusty padding slowly alongside or slightly behind, his orange tail held at a thoughtful angle, Walter found himself increasingly attuned to the cat's subtle cues, the slight lowering of ears that meant annoyance, the soft chirp that was a greeting, the intense stare that usually indicated the food bowl was approaching empty. He worried about Rusty's health, hovering perhaps more than necessary, checking his breathing while he slept, ensuring he was comfortable. The thought of losing this final unexpected companion was a quiet ache beneath the surface of his contentment, a fear he tried not to dwell on. He remembered reading once about soldiers forming bonds in the trenches, finding camaraderie and loyalty in the face of shared hardship and uncertain futures. He felt a similar connection with Rusty. Both bore the scars of past battles, Walter's visible, Rusty's hidden beneath his fur and in his ingrained wariness. Both had survived long odds. Both had navigated profound loneliness. They were, in a way he couldn't quite explain to anyone else, two old soldiers marching together through the final campaigns of their lives. The people of Harmony Creek had long since accepted Walter and Rusty as an inseparable unit. They were part of the town's fabric now. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, ostensibly to ask Walter about fixing a lawnmower, but really just to pass the time, offering a gentle scratch to Rusty's head if the cat happened to be on the porch and feeling tolerant. Walter found these interactions easier now. Rusty's presence seemed to act as a buffer, a shared neutral subject that smoothed the edges of social awkwardness. He was still a man of few words, but the silence around him felt less like a wall and more like a comfortable, shared space. One crisp autumn afternoon, Walter sat on the porch swing, gently rocking, a blanket tucked around his legs against the chill. Rusty was curled beside him, a warm, solid weight, his head resting on Walter's thigh, purring softly. The leaves on the maple tree in the yard were a riot of gold and crimson, preparing for their final descent. Walter looked down at the old cat, his hand resting lightly on the soft, familiar fur. He thought about the incredible journey that had brought them together. The scared young soldier, the starving kitten, the intervening decades of hardship and solitude, the improbable reunion, the slow, patient building of trust. Was it truly the same cat? He still didn't know for sure, but he knew with absolute certainty that this creature was his family, his steadfast companion, the anchor that had moored him in the quiet harbor of his later years. The memory of feeding that kitten felt less like a distinct event now and more like the beginning of a long, invisible thread that had finally, miraculously, led Rusty back to him, or him back to a part of himself he thought long lost. It was a story of resilience, of loyalty that defied logic, of kindness echoing across unimaginable distances of time and experience. Rusty stirred, shifting his weight, and looked up at Walter with his old green, trusting eyes. He let out a soft sigh, a sound of pure peace. Walter smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. He gently stroked the cat's head, feeling the familiar vibration of the purr beneath his hand. "Yeah, buddy," Walter murmured, his voice thick with affection. "We made it." They sat there together on the porch swing as the afternoon light faded, the old soldier and his ancient feline companion, wrapped in a quiet understanding that needed no words. The echoes of the past were still there, but they were softer now, harmonizing with the gentle rhythm of the present. The creak of the swing, the rustle of dry leaves, the steady, comforting purr of the orange cat who had come home. It was a profoundly touching, utterly unlikely ending, or rather, a continuing chapter, written in the quiet language of loyalty and shared solace.